He came home early expecting nothing more than a quiet return, a cup of tea with the woman who had raised him, and maybe a warm evening after weeks of traveling. But the moment David Thompson stepped through the side entrance of his mansion, the world he believed he had built with honesty and loyalty began to fracture. A voice he loved, his adoptive mother's, was trembling, apologizing, shrinking, and when he finally saw her, wearing a cleaning uniform she had never worn in her life, everything inside him went still. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. And what he was about to uncover would force him to decide what a son owes to the woman who saved his life. David Thompson wasn't a typical billionaire. Before the private jets and the boardrooms, he had been a quiet boy from the south side of Chicago, navigating a world that reminded him daily that he was different. His skin marked him in ways that went beyond simple observation. It became a lens through which others judged his potential, his intelligence, his worth. Ruth Williams had taken him in when he was 9, fresh out of the foster system that had nearly broken him. She wasn't wealthy, not even close. A retired nurse living on a modest pension in a neighborhood where gunshots punctuated summer nights in corner stores. Had bulletproof glass, she worked extra shifts at the urgent care clinic to buy him programming books. She packed his lunches with care, stayed awake through his nightmares about the group home, and encouraged him when teachers suggested he pursue more realistic career paths than computer science. David still remembered the first time a classmate's mother pulled her son away from him at a school event, whispering loud enough for him to hear, "Stay close to me." He was 10. He had been excited to show his science project. Ruth found him crying in the parking lot afterward, and instead of empty platitudes, she sat with him on the curb and said something he would never forget. "Baby, some people's fear makes them cruel, but their fear is about them, not about you. Don't you ever shrink yourself to make ignorance comfortable." Those words became his armor through years of coded language, through being followed in stores, through watching teachers call on him last or not at all, through scholarship interviews, where he was asked to prove his capabilities in ways his white peers never were. Ruth was there for all of it, the guidance counselor who suggested trade school instead of university, the professor who accused him of plagiarism on his best work, the venture capitalists who initially refused meetings until they saw his white business partner. For David, she wasn't the woman who adopted him. She was his mother, period. The only person who saw him fully and loved him without conditions, without suspicion, without the need to qualify his humanity. After years of relentless work coding through nights, proving himself twice as much for half the recognition, navigating boardrooms where he was often the only black face, David built an empire. His tech company revolutionized cloud security, and by 35, he had become one of the youngest black billionaires in America. Success, he learned, didn't erase racism, it just changed the flavor. Now it came wrapped in politeness, in impressive and articulate and dinner party questions about where he was really from. He insisted Ruth move into his Malibu home so she could finally live comfortably, so she could rest after decades of sacrifice. He asked nothing from her, only that she enjoy her life, tend the garden she loved, and finally feel safe after a lifetime of making safety for him in an unsafe world. Isabella Whitmore Thompson, his wife of 3 years, had seemed like the right choice. Educated, sophisticated, from old Connecticut money that traced back generations. She worked in philanthropy, spoke eloquently about social causes, posted the right quotes during Black History Month. She had pursued David with intensity, seemed to admire his journey, claimed to love that he stayed connected to his roots. Isabella had always acted warmly toward Ruth, at least when David was around. She called her mom, asked about her day, complimented her cooking. David had no reason to suspect anything different. He wanted to believe he had built something whole, a family united across differences. Proof that love could transcend the divisions he had spent his life navigating. But love, he would learn, is only as genuine as the person offering it. And some people are very skilled at performing goodness while practicing cruelty in the shadows. That evening, David returned 3 hours earlier than planned, canceling a corporate meeting in Singapore to surprise both women. He walked through the kitchen hallway carrying a small box of Ruth's favorite tea from Tokyo and a silk scarf he'd found in a market there, deep purple with gold threading, the kind of beauty Ruth deserved but rarely bought herself. But then He heard it, Isabella's tone, sharp and cold, slicing through the quiet house like a blade. Ruth's voice came next, softer, laced with a fear that made David's chest constrict. This wasn't the voice of the woman who had faced down aggressive landlords and hostile school administrators on his behalf. This was the voice of someone who had been systematically broken. David paused behind a marble pillar, listening. The words that followed drained the warmth from his chest. I've told you before, Ruth. You're lucky to even be here. Do you know how many women would kill to live in a house like this? But you're here as a favor. Don't forget that. I'm sorry, Isabella. I didn't mean to... You didn't mean to what? Be seen? That's the whole point. When my friends come over, I shouldn't have to explain why there's... Isabella paused, her voice dripping with disdain. Why you're just sitting around like you belong in the same spaces as us. It's embarrassing. David's hand tightened around the box of tea. I understand, Ruth whispered. I'll stay downstairs. Good, and Ruth, that uniform better be spotless tomorrow. My book club is coming, and I need this place to look a certain way. You understand what I mean by that, don't you? The implication hung in the air like poison. David stepped into the kitchen slowly, forcing his expression into neutrality even as rage built in his throat. Ruth was standing by the granite island, shoulders trembling, wearing a plain gray cleaning uniform he had never seen before. The same hands that had cradled him during childhood storms were clutching a cold cup of tea, as if trying to keep herself from shaking apart. Isabella didn't see him yet. She was facing Ruth, her posture radiating the particular confidence of someone who believes their position is unassailable. She was listing new rules: use the basement bathroom exclusively, avoid the main floor during daylight hours, stay out of sight when guests arrived, keep her ethnic cooking smells contained. Stop wandering around like she owned the place. Each instruction carried the tone of someone asserting dominance, not care. This wasn't about house management. This was about hierarchy, about putting someone in their place. About the same dynamics that had haunted Ruth's entire life now. Invading what was supposed to be her sanctuary, David felt a tightness in his chest. He hadn't felt since childhood, the same tightness he felt when boys at school mocked him for being adopted by the welfare lady. When teachers expressed surprise at his good grades, when store security followed him while white shoppers browsed freely. Back then, Ruth had wiped his face and told him that some people hurt others to feel powerful. But power meant nothing if it came from cruelty. That memory clung to him as he walked backward into the hallway, retreating to the garden instead of confronting them immediately. Confrontation would expose his anger before he understood the full scope of what had been happening. What he needed now was truth. Complete, undeniable truth. For 3 hours, David locked himself in his home office and reviewed weeks of security footage. He had installed the system years ago for safety, never imagining he'd use it to protect his mother from his wife. The deeper he looked, the more nauseous he became. Isabella, the woman he thought he knew, the woman who had smiled at charity galas and posted about racial justice on social media, had been systematically tormenting Ruth while masking it behind performance. He watched footage of her taking away a heater remote during winter nights, forcing Ruth to sleep in the cold basement guest room despite empty bedrooms upstairs. He saw clips of her intercepting and discarding letters from Ruth's old colleagues, women who had been her friends for decades. He watched Isabella delete medical appointment reminders from Ruth's phone, then complained to David about Ruth being forgetful and declining. One video showed Ruth preparing a homemade German chocolate cake, David's favorite, for the anniversary of her adoption. She had waited all evening for David to return from a business trip, the cake carefully displayed on the dining table. But Isabella arrived home first, saw the setup, and her face twisted into something ugly. Really, Ruth? You think this makes you special? You think this makes you his real mother? Ruth's face crumpled. I just wanted to... You're the help, Ruth. Accept it. You raised him because nobody else wanted him, and he pays you back by letting you live here. That's the transaction. Stop trying to be something you're not. Isabella then grabbed the cake and threw it directly into the trash, forcing Ruth to clean up her own celebration, her own love, her own attempt to mark a moment that meant everything to her. David had to pause the video. His hands were shaking, but there was more. So much more. Another recording showed something that made his blood run cold, a WhatsApp group chat called Malibu Elite Wives. Inside it, Isabella shared constant updates about Ruth, mocking her appearance, her age, her speech patterns, her hair, her body, her race. Her friends, wealthy white women with too much time and too little empathy, encouraged her enthusiastically. The messages were vile. Asterisk, girl, how do you even deal with her walking around your house? I'd lose my mind. Asterisk, asterisk, she'd probably think she hit the lottery. From the ghetto to Malibu, asterisk, asterisk, has she tried to steal anything yet? I'm dead serious. You should count your jewelry. Asterisk, asterisk, why does David even keep her around? Guilt? It's pathetic. Asterisk, asterisk, she looks so used up, like rough life ROUGH. Asterisk, asterisk, send her back to the hood where she belongs. I'm sure she has family in Section 8 somewhere. Asterisk, one woman, a hedge fund wife Isabella had introduced as her best friend, suggested that David should institutionalize Ruth to preserve the aesthetics of your home and marriage. Another joked about calling ICE. Despite Ruth being born in Alabama, Isabella's responses were worse. Asterisk. Trust me, I'm working on it. She won't be here much longer. Asterisk, asterisk, I've been documenting everything. Memory issues, confusion, instability. Building a case. Asterisk, asterisk, David's soft because of his background. But I can handle this. She'd be gone by spring. Asterisk, asterisk, honestly, the hardest part is pretending to care when he's around. She's so draining. Asterisk, then David found a separate folder on Isabella's cloud account, labeled Ruth Documentation. Inside were fabricated journal entries describing Ruth as increasingly unstable, confused, even aggressive. There were staged photos of messes Ruth had supposedly made. There were voice memos of Isabella practicing concerned phone calls to elder care attorneys. She was building a case to have Ruth declared incompetent, not for care. For removal, for erasure. The plan was meticulous. Isabella had research facilities that specialized in handling difficult family situations for wealthy clients, places that kept people quiet, medicated and out of the way. She had already scheduled preliminary consultations. She had drafted a narrative about Ruth's decline that painted David as a devoted son struggling with a heartbreaking situation. It was the kind of thing that happened to elderly black women. All the time, their autonomy stripped, their voices dismissed. Their families convinced they needed professional care when what they really needed was protection from the people who found them inconvenient. David felt something inside him shift. Permanently. This wasn't just marital betrayal. This wasn't just cruelty. This was the same dehumanization that had followed him his entire life, now weaponized against the woman who had shielded him from it. This was racism dressed in designer clothes and speaking with a Vassar accent. This was violence that would never be named as such because it came from manicured hands in a beautiful house, and he had brought it into Ruth's life by marrying someone he hadn't truly known. Asterisk, the next morning, David kept calm while Isabella performed concern. She sat across from him at breakfast in their sunlit dining room, wearing the cashmere robe he'd bought her in Milan, describing supposed episodes Ruth had been experiencing. David, honey, I didn't want to worry you, but Ruth has been struggling. Yesterday, she forgot what day it was. Last week, she couldn't remember where she put her keys. And she's been talking to herself in the garden. Every word was a lie, but Isabella delivered them with practiced worry, touching his hand gently. Isabella paused as if this was painful for her. I think we need to consider professional care. I'd been researching really wonderful facilities, places where she'd be safe, where professionals could monitor her. This house is too much for her now. The stairs, the space, she seems lost here. Ruth stood nearby at the kitchen counter, silent, shrinking into herself. David could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided eye contact. She was afraid to speak the truth. Months of psychological warfare had taught her that contradiction would only bring more suffering. But David wasn't fooled. He had evidence hours of it. He pretended to take Isabella seriously and asked where she intended to send Ruth. Isabella's eyes brightened with what she thought was victory. She named an expensive facility in Northern California known for discreetly handling wealthy families' problems. She even had brochures printed. I've already spoken with their intake coordinator, Isabella said. They have space available next month. I thought maybe we could visit together, make sure it's the right fit. David nodded slowly. That's thoughtful of you. Let me think about it. Isabella squeezed his hand, believing she had won. David spent the next several days gathering proof with the precision that had made him a successful CEO. He couldn't act on emotion. He needed documentation that would be legally unassailable, evidence that would protect Ruth from any future threat, and leverage that would ensure Isabella could never harm her again. He hired a private investigation firm that specialized in digital forensics, the kind used in corporate espionage cases. During a charity dinner Isabella attended with her book club friends, while she was distracted by champagne and gossip, the investigator briefly accessed her phone and created a complete mirror of its contents. Every message, every photo, every deleted file, every voice memo. Every Google search. What they found confirmed David's worst fears. Isabella had been playing this for nearly 18 months. The documentation began shortly after Ruth moved in, when Isabella realized that David's loyalty to his mother was non-negotiable. Rather than accept that reality, she had decided to remove the obstacle. The messages revealed that Isabella's friends had encouraged this from the start. They saw Ruth as evidence that David wasn't truly one of them, that despite his wealth, he carried markers of a background they found distasteful. Ruth's presence was a reminder that David came from a world they preferred to ignore, a world they believed should stay separate from their Malibu paradise. One message thread from early in the scheme showed Isabella venting. I thought marrying him would be different. I thought he'd want to distance himself from all that. But he actually wants her here in my house, like she's some kind of queen. It's humiliating. Her friend responded, You have to be strategic. Men like him have guilt. Use it. Make him think keeping her is actually hurting her. Make him think he's being selfish by forcing her to live in a world she doesn't fit into. Another friend added, Document everything. Memory issues are easy to fabricate. Get her out before she's written into the will or something. The investigator also found financial records showing Isabella had already paid deposits to 2 facilities. She had contacted elder care attorneys about guardianship proceedings. She had researched how to present a case for involuntary commitment. Most damning were the video recordings. Isabella had secretly made herself footage of her deliberately confusing Ruth by moving items and then asking where they were, of her hiding Ruth's medications and then expressing concern about Ruth's forgetfulness, of her staging messes. In Ruth's room to photograph as evidence of decline. It was gaslighting documented by the gaslighter herself. Preserved because Isabella was so confident she would never be caught. David also discovered that Isabella had been intercepting calls from Ruth's doctor, claiming to be her daughter-in-law and requesting changes to Ruth's prescriptions. She had tried to get Ruth prescribed anti-anxiety medications that would make her drowsy and confused, creating the very symptoms she was claiming to observe. It was elder abuse. It was psychological torture. And it was all motivated by a racism so deep that Isabella probably didn't even recognize it as such. To her, this was just maintaining standards, protecting her marriage, dealing with an uncomfortable situation. She would never call it what it was. A white woman attempting to erase a black woman who reminded her that her husband came from a world she considered beneath her. The night before the charity gala, David found Ruth alone in the garden she had carefully tended. The roses were blooming deep reds and soft yellows that Ruth said reminded her of her grandmother's garden in Alabama. She was sitting on a stone bench, hands folded in her lap, looking smaller than he remembered. David sat beside her in silence. For a long moment, the evening air was cool, carrying the salt smell of the ocean beyond the property walls. Mama, he said quietly. The name he hadn't used in months, the name Isabella had subtly discouraged him from using because it felt juvenile. For a man his age. Ruth looked at him, and he saw tears already forming. Has Isabella been mistreating you? The question hung between them. Ruth's face went through several expressions: relief, fear, shame, exhaustion. Years of strength fought against months of humiliation. Baby. I don't want to cause problems in your marriage, she finally said. That's not what I asked. Ruth's shoulders began to shake. I thought maybe I was being too sensitive. That maybe I was just in the way. She's your wife. This is her home. I didn't want to *, this is your home. David said firmly. I built this house for us. For you, everything I have exists because you gave me a foundation to build from. She says I embarrass you, Ruth whispered. She says your business partners don't understand why someone like me lives here. She says I'm holding you back from being taken seriously. David felt rage crystallize into something cold and purposeful. Someone like you. She said that? Ruth nodded, wiping her eyes. She says when they meet me, they see where you came from. They see the South Side. They see poverty. They see ... They see what trying to move past. I'm not trying to move past you, Mama. I'm not trying to move past where I came from. And anyone who thinks less of me because of you isn't someone whose opinion matters. She showed me the messages, Ruth admitted quietly. Her friends. The things they say about me. About how I look, how I talk, how... I don't belong in places like this. Her voice cracked. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong in Malibu. You belong anywhere I am, David said, taking her hands. They were cold despite the warm evening. And what she's done to you, what she's planning, it ends now. I promise you, Mama, what you've endured these months, it will not continue. Ruth looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. What are you going to do? Whatever I have to, David said. But I need you to trust me. And I need you to remember something you once told me. Some people's fear makes them cruel. But their fear is about them, not about us. Ruth managed a small smile. You remember that? I remember everything you taught me. They sat together as the sun set, and for the first time in months, Ruth's shoulders relaxed. The annual charity gala was Isabella's favorite event, a glittering evening where Malibu's wealthiest gathered to write tax-deductible checks while wearing clothes that cost more than most people's yearly rent. This year's cause was educational equity, a term that would be discussed extensively by people who had never set foot in an under-resourced school. Isabella shimmered in a custom Marchesa gown, her hair styled in perfect waves, her smile practiced. And brilliant. She worked the room with ease, air-kissing socialites, complimenting the men, gossiping with her inner circle. She believed she had won. She believed she had outmaneuvered David. Several of her friends from the WhatsApp group were there, clustered near the bar, identical in their wealth and whiteness and weaponized femininity. Has Ruth been moved out yet? One whispered to Isabella. Next month, Isabella whispered back. David's finally coming around. I convinced him it's best for her. That she'd be more comfortable with her own kind. She made air quotes with her fingers, laughing. What Isabella didn't know was that David had invited several people Isabella wouldn't have wanted there. A journalist from the Los Angeles Times working on a feature about elder abuse in wealthy families, a representative from the California Department of Elder Justice, and 3 of Ruth's oldest friends, retired black nurses, who Ruth thought had forgotten about her after. Isabella systematically cut off contact. When David and Ruth arrived together, the room's energy shifted. Ruth wasn't wearing a cleaning uniform or hiding in the basement. She wore an elegant navy dress David had commissioned specifically for her. Her natural hair styled beautifully, her head held high. She looked like what she was. A dignified woman who had survived decades of a world that tried to diminish her, and who refused to be erased. Isabella's smile faltered when she saw them, but she recovered quickly, moving toward them with practice. Grace. Ruth. You came. I didn't realize you'd be feeling up to it. The subtext was clear. You weren't invited. David insisted, Ruth said simply. The evening proceeded with surface normalcy. But David was watching, waiting. He saw how Isabella's friends whispered and glanced at Ruth. He saw the subtle ways they excluded her from conversations. The microaggressions disguised as politeness. At one point, a woman approached Ruth and spoke slowly, loudly, as if Ruth were hard of hearing or simple. It's so nice that you could come tonight. Ruth, who had a master's degree in nursing and had managed emergency room teams, simply smiled. When they returned home, David asked both women to join him in the living room. Isabella's smile faltered as she realized something was different. The confidence she'd worn all evening began to crack. Ruth stood straighter than she had in months. There was no uniform. No trembling. Just truth waiting to be spoken. David connected his tablet to the large television that dominated one wall of their living room. The screen flickered to life. Isabella, I want to show you something. The first message appeared. Then another. Then another. The WhatsApp group chat filled the screen, each message more damning than the last. The mockery, the slurs, the dehumanization, the conspiracy. Isabella's face drained of color. David, I can explain. Don't interrupt. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made her go silent. Next came the videos. Isabella watching Ruth, studying her, staging situations. Isabella throwing away Ruth's cake. Isabella stealing her letters. Isabella on the phone with the facility, describing a woman who didn't exist. Then came the recordings of Isabella's own voice, preserved in her memos, asterisk note to self. Moved Ruth's keys again. She looked for them for 20 minutes. We'll ask her about it tomorrow to establish confusion pattern. Increased her anxiety medication request approved. Should see drowsiness within a week. Called facility. Deposit paid. David will be upset initially, but we'll see it's for the best. Asterisk, with each piece of evidence, Isabella's constructed reality collapsed. She tried to deny everything at first. Then minimized it, then justified it. She doesn't fit here, David. Can't you see that? Your business partners. They see her and they see the South Side, they see poverty, they see a black woman. And so do you, David said coldly. Say it clearly. That's what this is about. Isabella's mouth opened and closed. I'm not racist. I voted for Obama. I donate to inner city schools. You tried to institutionalize my mother because she's black and poor and reminds you that your husband came from the same place. You and your friends called her ghetto and charity baggage and suggested I send her back where she belongs. You tried to erase her because her existence in your space made you uncomfortable. That's not. I was trying to protect you. From what? From the woman who saved my life. From the woman who worked herself to exhaustion so I could have books and food and love? Or from the reminder that I'll never be white enough for your world no matter how much money I make? The truth settled like ash. David showed her the final piece of evidence. The legal documents Isabella had prepared, the guardianship petitions, the involuntary commitment proceedings. You weren't just cruel, David said. You were systematic. This was a plan to remove my mother from my life by having her declared incompetent and locked away. Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand that what you did is a crime? Isabella's panic escalated to desperation. She turned to Ruth. Ruth, please, tell him I wasn't that bad. Tell him we can work this out. Tell him you called. Me, Vermin, Ruth said quietly. You said I smelled like poverty. You said my presence here was like having the help forget their place. You took away my heater in winter. You threw away my mail. You tried to convince my son I was losing my mind. Her voice grew stronger. You did all of this while smiling to my face, while posting about racial justice on your social media, while attending benefits for causes you claim to care about. I'll change, Isabella begged David. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever. It's too late, David said. Divorce papers were filed this morning. Your prenuptial agreement ensures you leave with exactly what you brought to this marriage, which is nothing I value. I've also forwarded all of this evidence to the police, to elder care authorities, and to several journalists. You can't destroy my life over this. You tried to destroy hers, David said. And unlike you, she had done nothing to deserve it except exist in a body and background you found offensive. Isabella's world collapsed in real time. She lunged for her phone, presumably to call her lawyer or her friends. But when she opened, her WhatsApp, the Elite Wives group, was gone. David had already sent each member their entire chat history along with a legal letter, indicating they could be called as witnesses in elder abuse proceedings. By morning, each one had blocked Isabella.her. Social circle evaporated overnight. The women who had encouraged her cruelty now pretended they never knew her. In their world, getting caught was the only real sin. Isabella left the mansion that night with 2 suitcases and the clothes she'd bought with her own money, which wasn't much. She moved into a modest apartment in the valley, the kind of neighborhood she'd once described as where people end up when they fail. Asterisk, the story broke 3 days later. The Los Angeles Times ran a feature titled Elder Abuse in Elite Spaces. How Wealth Hides Cruelty. It detailed Isabella's actions without naming her directly, but everyone in their social circle knew. Other publications followed. The story became part of a larger conversation about how racism operates in wealthy white spaces, how elder abuse often targets black women, how systems of power protect certain kinds of cruelty. Isabella's philanthropic boards quietly removed her. The charity organizations she'd used for social climbing issued statements about not tolerating abuse. Her friends who had participated in the group chat faced their own reckonings, some lost board positions, others faced social exile, one lost a major donor relationship when the family discovered the messages. David established a legal fund for elderly black women facing similar situations, systematic abuse masked as care, autonomy stripped away by those who viewed them as burdens. He partnered with elder justice advocates to train legal professionals on recognizing racism-motivated abuse. But the real transformation happened at home. Months passed. A year later, Ruth was back to being the woman David knew, strong, warm, resilient. At 68, she began teaching programming to children from low-income neighborhoods at a community center. David funded in her honor, named the Ruth Williams Center for Youth Technology. She walked into that classroom every afternoon with the same energy she once used to lift him out of childhood despair. The kids, mostly black and brown, mostly from backgrounds like David's, saw themselves in her. She told them about being followed in stores, about being underestimated, about being told to accept less. And then she showed them how to code, how to build, how to create futures that nobody could take from them. David often watched from the doorway, seeing his mother reclaim the strength that Isabella had tried to bury. Ruth had survived because resilience doesn't disappear, it only waits to be remembered, to be given space to breathe again. Isabella, meanwhile, discovered what life looks like when status evaporates. Her privileges dissolved. The friends who had applauded her cruelty now crossed the street to avoid her. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with furniture from IKEA, worked at a nonprofit for a fraction of her previous allowance, and learned what it meant to be invisible in the way she'd once made Ruth invisible. She sent David a message once, 6 months after the divorce. "Can we give it another chance? I understand now. I've changed." He didn't respond. Some damage cannot be undone. With apologies. Some cruelty reveals a core truth about a person that no amount of remorse can alter. 2 years after that terrible evening, David stood in the garden with Ruth, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The roses were blooming. Again, Ruth's careful tending had brought them back fuller than before. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Ruth said. "What's that, Mama?" "All those years I spent just trying to survive. Working extra shifts, stretching every dollar, trying to make sure you had what you needed. I thought that was all my life would be surviving. I never imagined I'd get to thrive. That I'd get to teach again. To matter to those kids the way I mattered to you." "You always mattered," David said. "I know, but the world doesn't always let black women know that. Especially not black women who grew up poor, who got old, who don't fit the picture of who's allowed to take up space." She squeezed his hand. "What Isabella did to me, it wasn't new. It was just a new version of what I faced my whole life. People wanting me to be smaller, quieter, gone. The only difference was I thought I'd finally earned a place where that wouldn't happen anymore." "You had earned it," David said. "You earned it every day you worked to raise me. You earned it every time you chose love when the world chose cruelty. And I'm sorry I didn't protect you sooner. Baby, you protected me the moment you believed me. So many women like me, nobody believes them. Their own children side with thee. Abuse her because it's easier. You did what too many sons don't do. You chose your mama over your comfort." They stood in silence, watching the light fade. "The kids at the center asked about you today," Ruth said. "They wanted to know if you'd come talk to them about building a company. I'd be honored. I told them your real success wasn't the company. It was remembering where you came from and not being ashamed of it. That's rarer than money." David thought about the years he'd spent navigating spaces that didn't want him, proving himself to people who would never fully see him. He thought about Isabella and her friends, who viewed Ruth's existence as evidence of something they needed to erase. He thought about all the black women who faced similar cruelty every day, whose dignity was constantly under assault, who had to fight just to be treated as human. The world hasn't changed much, has it? David said, the world changes slow, Ruth agreed. But we change faster, we learn, we teach. We make sure the next generation has to fight a little less than we did. She smiled. And sometimes, baby, we fight back. We expose the ugliness so it can't hide anymore. That's what you did. That's what those news stories did. Some of those rich women lost their positions. They had to face consequences. That doesn't happen often for people like them. It should happen more. It will. Because of people like you who refuse to look away. Because of those kids I'm teaching who'll grow up and build systems that can't be weaponized the way Isabella weaponized hers. Change is slow, but it's not impossible. The garden grew darker. Inside the house, Ruth's house, David's house, their shared sanctuary lights began to glow warm against the evening. Come on, Ruth said. I made your favorite cake. Real one this time, nobody to throw it away. David laughed, and the sound carried across the roses, across the life they'd built together, across the dignity that had survived every attempt to. Bury it, Dot, because in the end, the real story wasn't about a billionaire. It wasn't even just about a mother and son. It was about the quiet force of Black resilience, about the particular strength required to survive in spaces designed for your erasure, about the love that outlasts hatred, about the dignity that persists despite systematic attempts to destroy. It was about a Black woman who raised a Black boy in a world that told him he was worth less, who gave him tools to build despite every obstacle, and who survived long enough to see that love create something.